So what happens when we have these trauma responses? As I mentioned earlier, we're wired for connection as humans. People need other people. It's a primitive survival thing. We wouldn't be here doing fancy things like this if we were alone. And so what happens with trauma, though, is that pattern of protection or pattern of connection, sorry, gets swapped out. And so rather than going through the world in a way that allows us or seeks out even connection with others, we go into protection mode, safety first mode, which of course is a survival instinct. If we're not safe, we can't connect. So what happens when people are in environments where that trauma gets stirred up and triggered? They often go into patterns of protection just to stay safe. And again, not something people may have an awareness they're doing, may not have conscious control over doing that. This is often a nervous system response that is triggered without our awareness, unless we've done some work to be able to identify that. And that requires intention and often some support to do that. So this is what this can look like when we get into those trauma responses or those patterns of protection. Many of us have heard of fight and flight, right? We also have two others that are less frequently talked about. Freeze response, I think quite a few of you will probably be familiar with that. And then a fawn response, which is sort of the newer one at the table here. And it's a really interesting one. So fight and flight, that's usually our first instinctive response when we feel a sense of threat or unsafety. Our nervous system will be like, what is the best way to seek safety right now? And if power and control is a viable option, we'll go into a fight response. And that doesn't always literally mean fighting, right? It may not be a clear, obvious expression of violence or anger even. For some, it actually manifests as a very fierce sense of justice, a really strong desire to address things that people see as unfair or wrong. And that may mean people maybe are seen as difficult to work with or otherwise problematic, disruptive, challenging, maybe not always associated with a fight response. So of course, that strong sense of justice also has a great side to it. We need people to get fired up when things aren't fair, when people are done wrong by, right? When the world just isn't just. We need some people to say, stop it, it's not okay. So that fight response can actually be really quite functional and helpful. It's when it becomes something that the person isn't in control of. And that means it can get big fast without the person's sort of conscious awareness of it. And it can escalate into rage, anger, suspicion, and even physical threat. The other thing that happens when we go in these patterns of protection, our brain prioritizes our brainstem functioning, our survival brain functioning. Some people call this the primitive or the lizard brain. This is the first part of the brain to develop when we're growing as little tiny embryos. And it's the part that, makes sure our heart keeps beating and our lungs work and, we survive. The front of our brain, the frontal lobe there, that's where our executive functioning lives. So that's where we think about our options. We weigh out decisions. We are aware of consequences of our actions, where we actually can control impulses and maybe make, better, more informed decisions. What we know, though, is when people are in that trauma response, they can't access the frontal lobe. The brain goes, no, right now it is about survival first. So we are prioritizing all the energy, all the concentration of everything happening in your brain, suck straight down into that brainstem and says, no, we need to use all our resources for survival. So we're essentially cutting off access to the frontal lobe, which means cutting off access to the parts of us that say, whoa, slow down. Don't react right now. That's not going to serve you. Or maybe don't scream at this service provider because that's not going to go well, or they don't deserve that, right? We lose that ability to have insight, logic, reason. And so very often when people are in this state of fight, our response is to go at them with logic. I need you to calm down. Well, often if they could calm down, they would have. They probably wouldn't have escalated in the first place. So being able to think about that, even as we notice how others around us respond to that sort of going big, that fight, And that's often how I notice it's starting in folks is people will start to take up big space. They'll go big. And that may be with their body. They may stand up out of a chair or pull their shoulders back, arms by the side, look big. And that is what our brains are telling us are giving us the best shot of survival, right? Look bigger than the enemy, right? Intimidate them. That's what's going to keep you alive. And so people will do that. They may not take up big space physically. They may go with vocal big space, big, loud voice, screaming, yelling, right? Or big emotion. Could be big tears. But it's big in that it takes up a lot of space in the environment and it really does start to dominate. That's power and control. Then we go into a flight response. This is sort of the, well, if you can't fight or intimidate or control, then get out, leave. That's the best, safest option. So this is the run away. If a threat is coming, run the opposite direction. So keeping your distance. What we see though, in terms of how people access all sorts of services, is they may get to the door and not be able to go in. They might not show up at all. They may call and cancel a dozen times, which service providers are starting to understand a little bit, thankfully. It's still one that's tough though, because often we assign meaning, we fill in the blanks in that story. When people leave or don't show up, we're missing a ton of information about what happened. And so we start to feel maybe it wasn't that important, maybe they weren't ready. Maybe it's not as big a deal as they said it was. If it was such an urgent issue, why didn't they show up? Obviously they don't need my help today. I've also heard people say things that really reflect how we're doing when we encounter a flight response, like, well, obviously their time is more important than mine. And that, I think, is often, our struggle to try to make sense of people who are behaving in ways that we can't understand in the moment because we don't have the information. The other way we do a flight response, though, is lots of us numb out. And it's natural. Like we have to sometimes. But when it becomes the only coping strategy or the main coping strategy, that can become really challenging for folks. So numbing and avoidance behaviors may look like substance use. And that can be substance use that's been framed as addiction or substance use disorder. That can be substance use that the person feels is purely social, recreational, or non-problematic. But the function of it is to numb out, to not feel as intensely or not feel at all. And one of the most effective avenues for doing that is through substances. And that's why people do them, because they're really good at what they do. The challenge is it's tough to be in the world when we're numbed out from the world. There's a big downside health-wise and otherwise socially, to using substances in these ways, especially when it is our only way to cope. And we know with substances, it takes more and more and more to keep us from being overwhelmed and having to find other things to, feeling the discomfort and having to cope in other ways. But even those of us who don't use substances, we may use food in this way. Food is really powerful, and it's also a human need. It's necessity, right? So food isn't bad. It's just how we're using it, what its purpose is, and are we aware of how we do that? Gaming can be one way, where you don't realize so much time has passed, and maybe, that's your way of disengaging from the environment without leaving. And so we see kids do that a lot, I think, because they don't get the choice of, I'm going to go live somewhere else where it's less stressful. I'm going to be here because I have to be. And I'm going to find ways to disengage, disconnect, and sort of numb the discomfort of this environment. And it can also be after an intense experience like school, that numbing is a sense of relief. Scrolling on your phone is another way that people numb out. And it, again, not bad, right? I have great trauma around going to the dentist. So I use a lot of these strategies very intentionally to help me disengage from that intense emotion around that experience so that I'm not re-traumatized by going to the dentist, right? Because it goes to my coping strategies. However, we can also use things like work or achieving things, productivity, can be a way of staying separate from feelings that are difficult or distressing or uncomfortable. The irony of all of these is often they bring with them increased stress, which it decreases our coping capacity. So it's often a very big cycle that we get stuck in. And whether it's overthinking, analyzing, seeking perfection, seeking achievement, working too much. One of the things I'll point out, though, when it comes to stigma, of course, folks like me who cope and flee situations, we numb out by working too damn much, are far less likely to be seen as problematic. I'm actually often held up as an example in a really twisted way. Like, look at Erin. She works so hard. I work too much and I do it to avoid my real feelings. It is what it is. and it really has been difficult because that has become such a central part of who I am and how others view me, that it's hard to stop doing it. Because if I were using substances, everyone around me would probably be like, you need to stop that. That's not okay. You're killing yourself. You're ruining relationships. I am perhaps moving towards killing myself and ruining relationships in a different way that's more socially acceptable. So it's really, really important that we're aware that we're not sort of saying, these are all the bad coping and this is the good coping. Because those things are often much more messy than we have been led to believe. Freeze response. These are folks who often have mowed through their options on fight or flight and land at freeze. If I can't run and I can't fight, I need to just stop and stay. I need to shelter in place. And often the story that's told about a freeze response is if you are out in the woods and you see a bear, you may want to fight them and then you go, oh, I can't fight a bear. That's ridiculous. Maybe you try to run and realize you're not going to outrun them. So you curl up in a ball and play dead. That's a freeze response, an appropriate one. When we are in a world where the threat is maybe not as severe as we're assessing it, our nervous system is sort of over responding to threat and we feel unsafe a lot, we may struggle to engage. So we're shut down a lot. We may shut down as soon as there's challenge, threat, discomfort, where we just go flat. It often shows up in ways that look like depression. People self-isolate in a freeze response because they struggle to engage and move outside of themselves. So we often see folks struggle with things like sleep and just basic activities of daily living. We may see people with, where it's like, I'm not even really here sometimes. I'm here, but I'm not, which can show up in all of these actually. People may struggle with just like expressing emotion in an appropriate range. So think of yourself frozen in a block of ice, right? And that would even impact your ability to have a good cry, right? And so if you're doing this in a way that your nervous system is frozen up, it's going to be really challenging to process or express emotion. So people often go flat or they go despondent and get stuck in this place of there's no point, there's no hope, I don't know why I even try, which can be really challenging to connect with folks in those places. And we see that, again, that cutoff from our frontal lobe when people get indecisive. So a freeze response is, I can't pick a direction. I don't know what to do. People may struggle to act. They may be labeled as procrastinators and, or just generally indecisive, I can't make a decision. And often there's so much pressure with it that it just intensifies that freeze response because pressure makes it feel even less safe. And people just kind of like clench right up. And so you may see really slow response or no response from folks who are in a freeze state. And then that fawn response, like I said, lots of folks really find it interesting because the fawn response is about tending and befriending. It's about seeking safety by managing all the people and sometimes non-humans around you so that if your environment, the people in it feel safe, then you can sneak a little bit of safety out of that. It's not within you to create safety, it's managing others to create safety, which usually requires people to forfeit their own needs, their rights, their boundaries. And so we see folks who may be referred to as really negative things like a doormat, but these are often people viewed as people pleasers, right? Just keep everybody around me happy. I don't like conflict. If people say, well, what do you want, Erin? I might not even be able to come up with anything. I don't know. What do you want? Whatever's good with you is good with me. And that doesn't mean in those moments where we say those things, we're in a fawn response. It's when we get sort of in a way that we can't control it and we aren't able to logically or reasonably navigate our way through often, that's when we're in a fawn response. And for some people, these are persistent patterns that just keep showing up, and that in certain environments, maybe their family or at work, that's how they cope. Maybe it's caregiving, but again, caregiving isn't a bad thing, it's a great thing, but to our own detriment, not cool. So an example, I worked with a woman many years ago who was living in low-income housing. So she didn't have money. She really was struggling herself, yet she knew everyone in her little complex, and she was kind of like a maternal figure to lots of the folks in her building. And she would actually give money to people to pay their rent or cover their groceries or their bus pass. And that often meant she was in rent arrears and she was at risk of losing her housing almost all the time, which was a constant source of stress for her. And she knew it. And yet she persisted in caregiving to her own detriment, which was, the closest sort of a classic example of fawn response I could find. So these folks are often really considerate of others' needs, but almost deferential, right? Where it's only about others' needs. We don't have any needs to consider in this. So these folks are more likely to be going small, right? They want to shrink, almost disappear, not inconvenience anybody, not be the center of attention. So they may really struggle if they are, nominated for an award or pointed out, singled out in any way. It may feel horribly, not just awkward, but really, really discomforting and really, really stressful. And so that can actually amplify people's tendency towards focusing on others. So what happens then sometimes is that these patterns of protection, the way people show up, we go into systems like the healthcare system, a school, a correctional facility, any of these places that people end up sort of interacting with people. They may encounter ways of being, ways of delivering service, just relationships that have an echo or a mirror from their past. And so an example would be if somebody had an experience that was very difficult, where they weren't allowed to have full control over what they wore, right? They had a partner who said, no, you're not going out of this house wearing those clothes, put something else on. And they maybe have left that relationship, but they go to the hospital and they're told, you need to wear this gown in this way and leave your clothes over there in order to have this procedure done. That is a very separate and distinct situation, but that may be felt like a similar experience, right? I don't have control. I don't get a choice. Somebody's telling me what to do, whether I want to do it or not. And there's power involved, right? I need this procedure. You're in charge of how that's going to happen. I need to follow your guidance or your direction, or it's not going to get done. So I am beholden to this person. And that's sort of that mirror. It's not intentional, but it can cause harm. So what can happen for folks volunteering in and around these systems and service delivery settings, including therapy dog handlers, is you may be lumped in as part of the system. So you may not be seen as separate and apart from the healthcare system. You may be seen as somebody who's part of that. And that may mean you get folks reacting as if you're part of the controlling them, as if you're one of the people directing them and not giving them choices. And that doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It's actually a pretty predictable response to being put in a situation where people don't have power and control. It's just important to be aware that it might happen. Someone may give you a blast or a look or, not see that you're not part of this. You're separate, but with it. And the other beautiful thing, though, about working with therapy dogs and going into these environments is often there is a sense that you're separate and apart from while within that system. And there is an awareness of that that I think can be really helpful sometimes as well.